Okay, time to get started. Thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar. This is Getting Started with Web Automation, and this is actually going to be a 3-day series. This is kind of a lunch and learn format. I pulled this off of my cuff, decided to put this together. This is a somewhat informal type of session, really targeted toward kind of the same environment as a brown bag lunch that maybe you have been around with your organizations. So it's informal. I encourage you to ask questions. You can use the Q&A panel in GoToMeeting. Let me caveat things by saying there are a bunch of you. There is one of me. I will try to keep up with questions, but forgive me if I can't get to everything right away. I'll leave some time at the end to try to wrap up questions that folks may have. This is going to be somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes. The idea is, for many of you, it's early in the day or middle of the day. Just want to have this kind of a series of small, bite-sized webinars that'll help you with getting started with web automation. So, I am Jim Holmes. I'm the evangelist for Test Studio with Telerik. You can see my contact information up there. Feel free to make use of email or Twitter if you have questions or you want to follow up with things. My Twitter is my personal account, so it's a rather eclectic or scatterbrained collection of things. Also, the bit.ly link there at the bottom is the Test Studio blog, so I post a lot of announcements there. We've got technical articles and a number of other resources there as well. So let me get my screen rearranged a bit here. So the goals of this webinar series is over the next 3 days, I want to help you learn some fundamentals about web automation, learn kind of the next steps after you learn the most critical things. I'll give you some additional information, and really the largest goal here is to help you learn how to succeed with web automation down the road. Web automation is really easy to get started in, regardless of the tools that you're using. I'll be talking about WebDriver, Selenium, a little bit about Water, perhaps, and everything will be demonstrated using Test Studio for the most part, but these fundamentals are going to be the same regardless of what tool set you're using to do your automation. Web automation is really easy to jump into, get a few things done. After a week, everything seems to be running great. You're all excited. And then about a month down the road, you start scratching your head because you're running into some tougher areas. Your tests aren't running very stable. You're starting to find things take a lot more time to fix when your system changes. And then 3 to 4 months down the road, people start kind of throwing up their hands and they get really frustrated with issues that they're running into with their automation suites. And this is a really common pattern that I've seen time and time again, regardless of the tool set, regardless of the teams. So what I'm going to try to do is help you work across through some of those issues as I'm helping you learn about web automation fundamentals. So this is a 3-day series, 30 to 45 minutes a day. Do feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'm recording these sessions and will post them to tv.telerik.com as I finish up. It may take me a couple days to get caught up with everything, but you'll be able to find those again at tv.telerik.com. All right, so let's just go ahead and run into what the agenda is like. So we've got a number of automation fundamentals that I'm going to talk about today. Why do we want to do automation at all in the first place? How does automation work? There are some interesting mechanics that happen with that. Then we're going to break down into some very specific things that you need to understand about how web pages load up, how you interact with those web pages, what the structure's like, and then perhaps the biggest takeaway from today is going to be dealing with locators, and we'll learn a bit more about that. Tomorrow, getting a little more complex, starting to deal with dynamic content, things like AJAX or server-side calls. learning how to interact and work with tables. Tables can be oddly strange to deal with, and I'll show you some strategies around that. We'll talk about how you can make your tests more robust, and very critical, again, to that long-term success piece, being able to reuse some test functionality, so making things modular. Then finally, the third day, on Thursday, I'll be diving into a little more advanced topics. So learning about test setup and teardown steps, the idea of avoiding using your browser to do everything and dropping to code to help leverage things that you may already have built in your system to cut down your test times and to keep your tests more stable. Data driving is a great tip that you can use for running the same test multiple times, and we'll see some approaches to that. We'll talk about baseline data because the idea of starting with known good values for your system is really critical. And then, given enough time, we'll talk about some mechanics about how you might want to store your tests in source control and kind of some overall process things. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start jumping back into some automation fundamentals. And give me a moment while I have a quick drink here to kind of wet my throat a bit. Okay, so for getting rolling with this, one of the the demo app that I'm going to be using for a lot of illustrations and discussions is this idea of a customer relations management system and or contact relation management, depending on how you call it. So I can do things like I've got various users listed here, contacts. I can view them by popping something open here. I can add new contacts. I can save them out to a PDF file. This is kind of a common metaphor that we see, and this just lets me illustrate things like how the page loads, how we do a number of different things. So first off, why do we care about automated tests? Maybe you are in an organization that has a large number of manual testers. You've got an established QA department. And they have just a huge set of Excel files or Word documents, and they just run through those all the time, and that's your quality strategy. That's okay, but all of those scripts are just repetitious actions that people have to do. I think we're better off figuring out a way to automate those repetitious tasks and be able to let those testers do things like exploratory testing. Take a look at different areas that may be difficult to automate. Being able to automate tests means that we can start to build up histories of tests so that we can see trends. We can see that this month we've had a number of failing tests. We can do things like take a look at reports over time to generate information about how our overall quality strategy is. This is a lot easier to do when you've got automated tests in place because I can have those tests run repeatedly on a recurring cycle several times a day, maybe a large suite overnight, maybe a huge suite over the weekend. And I can get much quicker feedback on regressions than having our manual folks take a lot of time to run through those. And also with automation, we can do things like also get in performance tests so that I can start to take a look at how my trending is over time. I can fire up a suite of tests. I can run them through performance tests so that I start to see how we are doing over time, and I can detect when we've had an issue with, say, somebody hacking up a stored procedure or breaking something in our data access layer or somewhere that's causing us performance issues. This sort of stuff is very difficult to detect with manual because you don't have an easy way to gather up all those metrics. Let me quickly fire up my zoom tool here. All right. But with automated tests, I can do all of this. I can also look to do things like get histories of load tests so that I can, over time, do a number of things like checking how we're doing with various different load statistics, again, relating back to performance. Automated testing helps me with all of this. It frees up those manual testers to do what they do best, which is really use their brains to knock around and check hard-to-test areas of our system. All right, so with all of that in mind, let's talk really quickly about how an automated test works. So I'm going to have a test here that we'll take a look at. And the point of this test is simply to run me through the logon process. So this simply does the same action equivalent to this, logs me on, and validates that. So this is in Firefox here. I'm going to run this test back in Chrome, and you'll see that Chrome fires up, the test runs, we see some text get input to different fields, and then down here we can see that we've got a number of verifications. So that's nice, but how is this actually working? What's making that browser drive around? How does the browser know how to interact with things on the page? How does the browser know how to find all of that? These are really critical concepts that when you get into web automation, you start to get a grasp on. So when we run a test, when I fire that up, the general process is the same regardless of whether you're in Test Studio or you're using Selenium WebDriver or Visual Studio. There's a process that starts up a browser. Once that browser is live, we have to have a way to communicate with that browser. Now, in the initial version of Selenium, Selenium version 1, all of that was actually done through JavaScript communication within the browser itself. That turned out to be pretty brittle within Selenium 1. So Selenium 2, WebDriver, and Water, and a number of other tools, including Test Studio, have gone to a plugin approach. And that plugin approach you can kind of think of almost like a proxy that attaches to the running instance of the browser. And your test runner, Test Studio in this case, will communicate to that plugin in the browser and tell the browser what to do. So it's speaking to the browser's internal API, if you will. And the great thing about this approach is that you can write one test, and it's exactly the same when you're running against Firefox, Chrome, Safari, or IE. WebDriver does the same thing. It's really nice. Generally speaking, the plugin to that browser abstracts away all of the unique things about how that browser works. So you write one test, and the tool set handles kind of decrypting and decoding all of the communication with all of those different browsers. So we've got a plugin that's talking to the browser. It tells it to go navigate to a certain page. The page loads up. The plugin will then start telling the browser to communicate with that page, look for things on the page, type text into fields, for example, verify different fields. But once things are on the page, how do we know, for example, how to send text to the username box? How do we know how to send text to the password box? Once we've got something in there, how do we know how to find the login button to click it or to find specific areas on the screen to deal with? So this comes about by starting to understand what's going on in the browser and how that web page is actually formed. Let's bump back here, and we're going to take a look at how communication happens to a specific web page. So I'm going to go back to this performance test, and we're going to have a look at an actual communication chain here with a web page. So all of these here are the actions that the browser takes and the responses it gets back from the server. So in this case, the first thing that we have told the browser to do, again through the plugin that's talking to the browser, is we tell the browser to go to a location somewhere on the internet. In this case, it's my local server that I'm running off of. The browser reaches out to the server, says, "Hi, I'm here. What do you have at this location? Give me everything you've got at that location that makes up this page or this resource." The server then starts to send all of these little bits and pieces of information, such as some text, some cascading style sheets, we've got some JavaScript pieces, we've got some logos, we've got some other text, so on and forth. So all of these little pieces of information get passed back to the browser, and the browser then assembles all of that back. Now if we take a look at the page here, we can do a view page source, and now we're taking a look at the actual source HTML that's on this page. So all of this corresponds back to these bits and pieces that we used, that we grabbed from the server, that the server offered up to us. So the browser takes all of that information, pieces it together, and renders it so that we end up with this visual page here. You'll note that we got images in here and here, we got text in, we've got different colors, so that means that we got our style sheets in, and we've even got a number of different pieces of JavaScript on the page that do things like validate whether or not we have content in both of our username and password fields to activate the login button. Alright, so with that in mind, this is now the source of that page, and this is what we call the document object model. This is the page DOM. And the DOM, you notice, is lots of elements here. Elements can have content within inside of them. So here's a div element. That div element contains a number of other elements within it. And elements can also have tags, or pardon me, attributes. So in this case, we have an ID attribute that's top bar for its value. Further on down, we have a input field with an ID of username, and there's another attribute called name, and that's also username. All of these different components, elements, attributes, child elements, comprise the DOM. So when the test is playing back and we want to do something like find the username field, there are several different ways that we can actually access that. So let me pull up one quick slide here. So if we have a look at this markup, and this is actually that same exact page that we were looking at, you can see that the DOM gives us a structure. It gives us a hierarchy. So we start at the top element, HTML. We move down to body. We look for the third div element, and that says div whack2, but we actually do things counting by 0 reference. We can then move down from that div to another child div, or pardon me, a form underneath that, and then another div under there, and then finally an input element. But you'll notice that that's kind of hardwired in. That points to a specific path, and if the contents under that path change, like this, meaning we swap the username and password field, then our tests are actually going to start to fail because, for example, we're putting our password text down in the username field and vice versa. So these sorts of locators, ways of accessing those elements, aren't really great. This is actually called XPath. You can also call it HTML path, depending on what type of technology you're working with. So a better way of looking at that is instead to have a look at different ways to access those. So instead of hardwiring things in, we can take a look at accessing things by ID values. If we're talking straight web technology, the ID attribute is a great way to look at things, because per the HTML spec, a valid HTML page can only have one ID value of a certain name. So I can only have one element anywhere on a page that's named username. I can only have one element that's named password anywhere on the page. So let's take a look at how this is a great thing, because when we go to run some tests, so we'll notice we have username and password here. Let me do a quick bit of hacking around here. I'm actually going to change the layout of that page. And so now, note that I've got password and username. So I've got some tests that I've loaded up here in Test Studio. You already saw this one run. And if I run this again, I've changed my UI, but the test will still pass because I've built that locator using an ID value, not a hardwired XPath. Alright, so these locators are the key piece that we want to deal with. Whenever possible, we want to focus on using that ID value. By the way, this is Firebug that I'm using here, and it's got a great little feature that lets me zoom in and drill straight down. And if I'd avoid hitting the wrong keys, that would also be very useful. Alright, so there's our username. Here's our username field. Locators are how I've just laid out that we can interact with the page, that we find things to either inject text to or validate things against. When you're writing up those locators, if you can't use an ID value, and there are a number of cases where that may not be appropriate. For example, you might have widgets where there are multiple ones on a page. You might have some other, maybe you're working with a legacy application where you don't have things like that available. If you don't have that available, a great second choice is to work with something like a name attribute or a class. So the name attribute isn't guaranteed to be unique on the page, but it may be unique enough for you. The class is a CSS style class, and these can also be great ways of dealing with your locators on the page. So the next critical thing to understand about locators is that you want to be able to store those locators in one location and only have them defined once. If you are a software developer, you may be familiar with the term dry. Don't repeat yourself. So the idea is that in the systems we build in our code bases, we want to avoid duplication anywhere. We want to do the same with our tests, and particularly with our locators. So the locators that I had that defined where username and password were, I want to be able to store in a central repository. So with Test Studio, we've got the element repository that lets me store all of the elements for all of my tests across the entire test suite. And every test that references a particular field, such as the username field, now looks to store this in one central spot. And we can see that that element is used by five different tests here. All of them refer back to this one central definition. So if you're working with code, the idea would be that you've got something akin to a class instance that has all of your definitions located in it. You know, maybe you've got constants and other things defined in one spot. This is exactly the same notion. And oh, by the way, if you were working with WebDriver or Selenium 1 or Water or some other code-based tool set, you want to follow that same pattern. There's what's called a page object pattern that lets you define all of those locators in one specific spot. Actually, I think I may even have an example of that. So I'm going a little off topic here, and while I'm waiting on Studio to start up, let me answer a couple questions in the queue. There's a question about whether or not Test Studio is able to work on non-web applications. We can work with WPF or Silverlight out of browser. There's also a question about if it's possible to invoke Test Studio's tests from Visual Studio 2010. Yes, there's a Test Studio Express edition that works inside of Visual Studio. You can also integrate Test Studio with TFS and TFS Build. Alright, so here is a test that I have built in WebDriver, and I think this is like version 2.26. And with the page object pattern, I've actually created a class for the login page. And this class really mimics all of the functionality on the entire logon page here, to include links that I need to interact with, the form that I need to fill in. And with WebDriver, you have some additional functionality where I don't have to specifically define those locators. I tell WebDriver how I want those locators to be found. And in this case, it's via ID. This varies a little bit by different tool sets. Water works a little differently. Some of the Ruby gems work a little differently. My point being is that every other test that I write, I simply refer back to that page, and that page knows where all of the actual elements are on the page, so that I can just tell the page, build everything up, log yourself on, and the page knows how to handle that. All of those elements are defined in one spot, and one spot only, regardless of whether I'm doing something in Page Object or using Test Studio. If I had those locators defined out across, say, all of those 6 different tests that I was working with, when I had changed my screen around, or if I had done something like change the user ID, or pardon me, the field on that, then I'd have to go back and clean up every one of my tests. So let's see that as an example. So I've got test lists here. I'm not going to run this, but this is all of my basic logon tests that validate functionality. So I've moved my name, username, and password field around. Let's say that I wanted to change the value for that form here. We'll reload this. Let's go back and take a look at the username field. Now we can see that we've got a different ID here. So now my locator's broken. And if I go back to my initial test here that you've seen run a couple times, I'll rerun this, and we'll see that fail because last time I moved the location around, but I had the same ID value. It could find things. Now I've moved the location around, but I've got a different ID value, and the test fails. So it couldn't even find how to deal with that test, with the username field here. So if I had my locators scattered all over the place, I'd now have to go and fix up each one of these tests that referenced it. Instead, what I can do is simply go to that element, find a test step that uses that particular element, and I can update that in one place, and we'll fix all of the tests that refer back to that element. So again, I'm doing this in Test Studio. It's having to go out. It's starting up the page. It's getting me to the page. It's locating everything on the DOM. It's connecting to that browser instance. And now when I come back in here, I can change to the new ID that we have. Validate that. We see it's good. Save. And now here's the great part. Because we're using the element repository, I can update all of these tests at one fell swoop right there. So that's going to save everything. So now we can come back to this test. We'll rerun this test, and it'll pass now, as would all of those other tests that reference that same element. So if I was working with WebDriver and I was doing PageObject pattern, I could simply fix the element here, for example, and all of the other tests that I'd written in my WebDriver suite would again just work. So regardless of what tool set you're using, find out how you can centrally store those locators, understand the tool and how to interact and change those locators when you need to, and figure out how to leverage the tools. But most importantly, understand what's going on with your document object model. Understand how that page loads up. Get familiar with working with the document object model with the page DOM so that you can understand what's happening with your locators, so that you understand what those locators look like, when you can use different types of locators, and how to keep them as flexible as possible. All right, so I'm coming up on about 40 minutes here. This was really all we had on the agenda for today. Some overall things about automation. How does automation work? Talking about the page loading lifecycle, the DOM, and dealing with locators. So automation's biggest strengths are handling regression type scenarios for you. Automation is not great at doing exploratory testing. You can write some very complex algorithms to have your tests search around and do things extraordinarily dynamically, but the question becomes, do you want to spend huge amounts of time trying to figure out some artificial intelligence to make that happen, or do you just want to offload your high-value regression tests to your automation suite and then let your manual testers and the rest of your team do that exploratory? I think automation's value is in covering those high-value regressions and letting people do smart things manually. Automation works by starting up a process that creates a browser. In Test Studio, we attach a plugin to that browser, and that plugin is then responsible for knowing how to make the browser navigate, how to make the browser interact with the page. That's different for each of the different types of browsers. And the great thing about tools like Test Studio or WebDriver, which uses the same type of model, is that you write one test. You don't have to change that test for different browser types. Rather, the tool and the framework handle that for you, that layer of abstraction. That plugin handles all of that communication to the browser. It lets you interact with items on the page DOM. When the page is loaded, all of those pieces are pieced together in a structure called the document object model. There's a hierarchy there. That hierarchy consists of elements. Elements may have child and grandchild ad nauseum. There are attributes that you can use. There are different tags on those. And understanding that locators are how your test framework and test tool are able to locate things on the page to do verifications, to inject text on there, to click buttons, to click links, those sorts of things. It's really critical that whatever tool set you're using, you centralize the storage of your locators. If you're writing tests in code, please use the page object pattern. There's a lot of good documentation and blogs around on that pattern. Test Studio does that out of the box for you with our element repository. Then you need to understand how to update those locators if your UI changes so that you can go back and in one spot update that particular locator for that find logic, and then all of your tests should work again. You also should understand why it's so critical whenever possible to use ID values or something very flexible. That lets you worry less about when your ID moves, when your UI moves around, your tests won't break. But if you're using brittle locators like HTML path or XPath, the instant you make a small change to the UI, it's very likely that your tests will break. So, find good locators, store them centrally, understand how the page loads, understand the DOM, and understand the benefits of automation overall. Okay, so that's it for the content for today. I appreciate everyone joining in. I'm going to take about another 5 or 10 minutes and work through some of the questions in the queue. Please, by all means, feel free to add your own questions here if you'd like, and I'll just be working through this. So there's a question about objects with dynamic naming. The particular example was given using extend.js. There are a number of different tools and frameworks that cause IDs to be dynamically generated. If you're familiar with ASP.NET, then a lot of times you can end up with some very nasty dynamic locators. I've got a somewhat flippant example here, which people may or may not have seen. The idea is wherever that control is placed, you'll end up with a changing, odd, and fairly useless ID. Now, this varies by platform and by tool, but a lot of times you can do something like add a suffix to that particular ID. So basically here, if I can add something called password at the end of that ID, I don't necessarily care about all of this other information here. What I can then use is I can use my tool set to work with, let me dive down here and back to this. Okay, so let me go edit this guy again. Many good test frameworks and test tools will actually let you use a locator that has either a regular expression or something like starts with, ends with, contains. So that way you can add this suffix to your locator and then tell your test framework to just find any locator that ends with this particular value. All right, so in this case, we can see that my locator is the ID is exactly new ID. But I can also do things like contains, does not contain, starts with, and here to me is the magic one. So if I can just get the developers to add a suffix, then I can use that ends with to control that. All right, so now I don't know the particulars about extend.js, if that's something that won't work in this particular instance. Then another thing that you can take a look at is an approach where you might do something like this. So your control or field or whatever that you're dealing with, for example, might be that box number 1. All right, so that's a field. It's got a dynamic ID, but maybe you can put that inside of another container that has a static ID. And now this way I can start from sidebar and work out an XPath to get down to the field that I need. And it's much less brittle than trying to get an XPath from the top of the document all the way down to that particular field. So I hope that answered that question. If it didn't, please let me know and I'll try to get something around that. So there's a question about any documentation on locators that I'd like to share. There is some good documentation in our help system that you could have a look at for that. So there's a question about whether we can use Telerik with Java. So I'll say it depends. And what I mean by that is that Test Studio works with HTML or Silverlight applications, and we only care what comes across the wire. So in this case, this demo application is actually written in Ruby, and we work with it just fine because what's coming across the wire is HTML back to us. So if your application is written in Java or C++ or Perl or COBOL, it doesn't matter. We only work with the user interface. Now, if you're looking to do coded steps through Test Studio, that's all in .NET, so either VB.NET or C#. All right, there's a question about testing validations. If the password accepts only 6 characters, that would be a matter of just writing a test around looking for an error message. So I don't have that specific one, but I've got something that's very similar that I can show you. So here's a test that inserts a bad username and password and then looks for a specific error message. Just that we've got a or does this? Let's run this really quickly and see what this does. That actually doesn't get... No, this is awesome. You've made me find a test that I really don't do very well here. That doesn't actually validate that the error message is there. So I'll show you on here, and let's go build this test up to be a little better test. So we will have this enter invalid text, and then we'll find that error message here, and we'll test for its contents. So the idea here would be pretty much what you're asking. You just have to put in more or less characters and look for the appropriate error message. So here I want to actually validate that this particular element contains invalid username or password. This would be where you would, on your particular application, look for your specific error message. So you should get the idea there. So I've added that validation here. Now when I run this back, we should see that work. So hopefully that answers your question about that. All right, working through a few other questions here. Okay, so here's a question specifically about Test Studio. So the idea is about cross-browser compatibility. Test Studio records everything in IE, but will play back in Firefox, Safari, or Chrome. So I think you saw me play this back in Chrome, but the same script without any alterations will also run in Firefox, Safari, and IE. And this gets back to what I mentioned about how we execute the tests. We are actually attaching a plugin to each specific browser type. That plugin knows how to interact with that browser type, and it handles all of the abstraction and the differences between the different browsers. So I don't have to change my test at all. I can keep running it through the different browser types without ever touching the test. All right, I think I have gotten through all of the various questions here. I'll wait another moment or two to catch up with anybody else who still has questions. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. And let me actually bounce back to my contact information in case anybody needs that. Thanks for joining us, and I'll wait around about 2 or 3 or more minutes to catch up any other questions folks might have. So there's a question about whether or not Telerik can, Test Studio can be used to take screenshots of the application and then use that for cross-browser compatibility checks. This is a question we get all the time, and we do support image verification, but here's a case where it can be extraordinarily difficult to automate and to get it to work stably and not give you false failures. Image verification is based on screenshots, so you take a screenshot on your system when you first run things. You then have your test run on a different machine through automation, and it takes screenshots there and compares them back to yours. If the resolution of the two systems is different, the test will fail. If there are any differences in the graphics display cards that cause colors to be slightly shifted, your tests will fail. If you didn't have the capture region set up specifically and ensure that the browser is set to the same exact size every time, the tests will fail. So this is one of those things where, yes, you could automate it. You could spend a lot of time writing coded steps to basically run the test once on the target machine, capture all of the screenshots, then run through all of the different browsers and compare to that original snapshot on that machine for that specific run. This takes a lot of time to develop and get right. It may be better to just simply have humans do that step to be able to compare things. You can do it. It can get really extraordinarily difficult and painful. This is one of those things where we aren't magic, and we can't make magic happen like that. There are other tools that help with that out on the market. If you're really set on that approach, we're probably not the right tool for that. So, a question about having different browsers. This kind of goes back to the same thing. Having different running tests against different browsers with a different UI. Yes, the UIs will look differently. You should think of Test Studio as validating the different the same functional slice through different browsers, rather than the same UI through different browsers. We don't, without extraordinary levels of effort, we're not going to be able to help you validate differences in UIs between the different browsers. What you should focus on with automation is, does my application behave the same in IE, Chrome, and Safari? Can I do the same exact things? And if that's the case, that's where we're awesome at. I've tried to work a number of browser compatibility tests in previous jobs, and this is one of the things that our cross-browser compatibility really excels at. So, a question about how different tests are run with different browsers. We've seen that here in the test execution list. I just select whatever browser I want. If I'm working with test lists, I can take my test list, I can edit its settings. And so a test list I didn't cover in this session, but this is groups of tests, if you will. I can then choose what different browsers I want this list to execute against. I run that list, and it'll run all of those tests first in Chrome, and then it'll run the same tests again in Firefox. So you can select single tests to run against different browsers, or multiple tests via a test list to run against that. Okay, I think we are pretty much through all of the questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and close down the session. Again, thanks to everyone for joining, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye-bye.